Imagine that you live in a world where everything is under control, where every detail of your life is in its place. Now imagine that in an instant that world falls apart. Your son, whom you raised alone, turns out to have been secretly dating for years the man you kept silent about for so long, his real father. The father you hated, the one you were sure would never come into your life again. And now that man is here again. What do you do when the past you tried to bury comes back with such force that it destroys everything around you? The hardest part is not accepting the truth, but deciding what to do about it. What to do when the man you thought was part of a long-forgotten history suddenly becomes part of your present, through the most precious thing of all, your son. Forgive, reconcile, or lose everything you've built up over so many years? Answering these questions is not easy when every encounter with the past brings to life and reminds you of feelings you thought you had buried forever.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
Hi, my name is Mary, and today I'm going to tell you one of the most difficult and painful stories of my life. A story that intertwines love for my son, hatred for the past, and difficult life decisions. It's a story that started many years ago, but came as a real shock to me only recently. Do you ever feel like everything you believed in is suddenly crumbling? When you're living your life, you think you're in control of everything around you, and then it turns out that's not what happened at all. That's what happened to me. My son Harry is now 22. I've raised him alone his whole life, and frankly, I'm proud that I've been able to give him everything I could. Love, care, attention. I tried to be both mother and father to him. His father died when Harry was only 2 years old. It's a tragedy that still echoes in my soul, even after all these years. Harry and I were always very close, but like all teenagers, at some point he became distant. I thought it was normal, just normal teenage problems. He started spending more time away from home, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. I trusted him, I tried to keep him out of it, but one thing bothered me. Where did he get the money? I knew he didn't have a job, but he always found a way to pay for things himself. When I asked him about it, he was evasive, so I thought maybe he was just moonlighting somewhere and didn't want to tell me. But the anxiety grew. At some point, I started to notice him going to a certain place. I followed him, and that's where my personal tragedy began. He wasn't going to a friend's house. He was going to a different neighborhood, to a small house on the edge of town. And there, when I finally plucked up the courage to follow him, I saw a man. A man I didn't know. But the way they were talking, the way they were interacting, I knew right away that this wasn't just a casual acquaintance. Harry was too close to him. I stood in shock as I watched the man hand him money, as they exchanged jokes and warm words. It was like a punch in the gut. Who is he? Why is my son keeping this from me? And how did he even meet this man? That night I couldn't sleep. My thoughts fluttered around in my head like wild birds. And the only question I asked myself over and over again was, what to do now? The next morning I decided I had to talk to Harry. Straightforward, no innuendos, no detours. I knew I would do anything to find out the truth. And so, imagine this scene. I sat across from him, fists clenched to keep my emotions in check. I started softly, calmly, so as not to scare him off. I asked him where he'd been the night before. He started to dodge again, but I didn't give him the opportunity. I told him I knew where he'd gone and I'd seen him with that man. Silence. The dead silence that hung between us was worse than any scream. Harry turned pale, and I knew the truth was about to come out. Who is it? I asked, barely able to contain myself. Why didn't you tell me? He didn't say anything. He didn't say anything for so long that I was beginning to think he wouldn't answer at all. But then he spoke, and what I heard literally knocked me off my feet. It turned out that this man was his real father. Alex. Yes, the Alex I thought I'd never hear from again. We broke up when Harry was only a few months old. I was sure it was for the best for both of us. Harry was my salvation and Alex was a mistake of youth that I was trying to get rid of. I told myself I wanted nothing to do with him, and I certainly wasn't going to tell Harry he existed. But now it turned out that my son not only knew about him, but had been secretly dating him for years. He'd found out about his real father by accident, by stumbling across old letters that Alex had once sent me. letters I'd hidden and forgotten about. But Harry found them, read them, and decided to track him down himself. They started dating when Harry was 16. Can you believe it? 16. All this time, all these years, my son was going to him, getting money from him, talking to him about life, and I had no idea. How? How is that possible? At this point, you're probably wondering what happened next. Yeah, me too. But this is where it all begins. Because there were even more difficult questions ahead of me that, frankly, I still don't know the right answers to. I didn't know how to react. Forgive? Accept? Accept Alex into our lives, if only to avoid losing Harry? Or continue to struggle with the past I'd spent so long trying to forget? The choice seemed simple. But it wasn't for me. When I heard the truth from Harry, I was literally overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. It was a cocktail of resentment, hurt, and fear. Yes, fear. Fear of losing him. Fear that now that he had Alex in his life, he wouldn't need me anymore. To be honest, it took me a while to realize what to do. My first reaction was to put it all out of my mind. Pretend it didn't exist. I was willing to make it my goal to keep my son by any means necessary, even if it meant ignoring something I hated. But can you do that? Ignore a man who's already tightly entwined in your son's life? And more importantly, could it really save our relationship? Harry and I sat across from each other, and I couldn't find the words. I could not find the words, but I could see images of the past. Alex, our youth, our quarrels, our separation. I remembered the day we'd broken up, and I'd sworn to myself that I never wanted to see him again. My life changed when George came along. He was my salvation, my rock. He'd made me feel alive again, not the young, naive girl who'd gotten caught up in the cycle of feelings with Alex. But now it was all back. And it wasn't just back through my own son. I didn't know what to say to Harry. He was sitting across from me, staring at me like he was waiting for a verdict. And I couldn't even breathe properly. I felt like everything I held dear was being taken away from me. You should have told me, I finally whispered. He looked away. The silence was weighing on both of us. I knew he understood how I felt. But I understood him too. As much as it pained me, I knew Harry was seeking a connection to his father. It was inevitable. Why did you go to him? Why didn't you tell me? Harry sighed quietly and answered. Because I was afraid you wouldn't understand. You always told me Daddy was dead. I thought it was true. His words cut me to the core. How could I explain to him that in hiding the truth, I was only trying to protect him? That I was trying to create a perfect world for him where there was no room for Alex? But could I blame him for searching for his roots? After all, Alex was his biological father, as much as I hated to admit it. In that moment, I realized one important thing. I couldn't take away Harry's past, his right to know the truth. But what about my past? What do I do with the fact that I hate Alex? How do I accept the man who once made me miserable, and now has become a part of my life again through my son? I decided to talk to Alex. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew we couldn't move on otherwise. Yes, I still hated him, but I had to do it for Harry. So I texted him. Just, we need to meet. It's important. The reply came quickly. He said yes. When I arrived at the meeting, my heart was in a storm. We met at a small cafe, the same one we used to love to go to long ago. Alex hadn't changed much. Just a little older, wiser in appearance, but his gaze was the same as it had been years ago, penetrating straight into my soul. Hi, he said as I approached the table. I sat down across from him in silence. I didn't know how to start a conversation. What was there to talk about? The fact that he'd come into my son's life without my knowledge? That he ruined the peaceful life I'd spent so many years building? I know what you're going to say, he began, as if he could read my mind. But Mary, look, I'm not going to interfere in your life. I just wanted to know my son. Those words brought me no comfort. They only made me angry. How could he talk about it so calmly? He didn't even try to understand how hard it was for me when he just disappeared, leaving me alone with a small child. Why did you come back? I asked, looking into his eyes. Why didn't you leave us alone? Alex sighed and rubbed his temples. Because I'm his father. Because I couldn't sit back and watch my life pass me by anymore. And I don't even know my own child. You don't know him because you left. My patience was wearing thin. You left us. And now you want to come back and pretend everything's okay? Do you really think it's that easy? He stopped talking. The seconds dragged on like minutes. I saw his face tense, and then he said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I can't change the past, Mary, but I can at least try to fix something now." Those words hurt me. I didn't want to forgive him, I didn't want him in our lives. But I also knew that Harry had already made his choice, and if I didn't accept it, I could lose my son forever. We sat in that cafe for a long time, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I tried to make sense of myself, of my feelings. How do I live with this? How do I accept Alex in our lives? I knew one thing. If I didn't find a way to deal with this situation, I could lose not only my peace, but most importantly my son. I left the cafe that day with a heavy feeling in my chest. Talking to Alex didn't give me any relief or insight into what to do next. The only thing that became clear was that everything had changed forever. Time couldn't go back, the past couldn't be undone, and the future depended on my decision. I walked home for a long time trying to get my thoughts together. You know how it is when your head is as noisy as an electric train, and no thought wants to linger for long? That's how it was for me. Two forces were fighting inside me. Love for my son and hatred for the past. How hard it is when the two strongest feelings are tearing you apart, and you can't choose which one will win. When I got home, Harry was waiting for me in the kitchen. He'd always been like that, sensitive, understanding, and strangely enough, in this moment his concern only made my pain worse. He wanted to help, but he himself was part of what had brought me to this state. "Did you meet him?" Harry asked quietly. I nodded. My emotions were still boiling inside me, but I knew I couldn't take it out on my son. It wasn't his fault what had happened after all. Was it my fault? Maybe. Or maybe we all did what we could under the conditions we had. "What did he say?" Harry went on. I looked at him, and the wave of emotion washed over me again. He was a grown man, but in that moment I saw him as the same little boy who had once believed that the world was divided into black and white. Now the world was much more complicated for him. I saw him trying to make sense of the situation, and I needed to help him. "He said he wanted to be a part of your life," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Harry lowered his eyes. It must have been hard for him too. "I know this is hard for you to accept," he said finally. "But I can't just stop talking to him, Mom. I know he's my father, and I want to get to know him." Those words were like freezing rain. Every phrase was drenched in truth, and I knew I couldn't change his mind. But that didn't make it any easier. I already realized that I had only one choice in my hands: accept it or fight to the last, risking losing Harry forever. "I'm not asking you to stop talking to him," I said, though every word was hard to say. I don't know how to accept it. How to accept him back in our lives." Harry nodded, but it was obvious he was having a hard time. He walked over to me and put his arms around me, and I felt his embrace give me back some of my calm. We stood like that for a few minutes in silence. And, in that moment I realized that I was ready to fight for our connection, for our family. But the question was different. At what cost? Few weeks went by. Life seemed to be back on track, but the atmosphere in the house remained tense. Harry was still seeing Alex, and even though I knew it, it tormented me. But I didn't follow him anymore, didn't try to control his every move. That all changed when he came home one day with news that seemed to turn my life upside down once again. "Mom," he began, quiet as always, as if he was preparing me for something unpleasant. "Alex wants to meet you. He said he wanted to talk." I felt the blood rush to my face. My heart pounded faster. The moment I'd been dreading had arrived. Alex wanted to be a part of my life again. Not just through Harry, but directly. I had to make a choice. Honestly, I didn't know if I was ready for it. But I already realized that if I didn't go along with it, I would lose everything. I could continue to hate Alex, but I couldn't ignore his existence in my son's life. "Okay," I answered, looking at Harry. "We'll meet up." Artyom looked surprised. I think he was expecting a refusal, but I realized that it was important to him, and if I wanted to save our relationship, I would have to do something that seemed impossible. We agreed to all meet together. It was a strange feeling, sitting across from someone who was once everything to you and then became nothing. And now that nobody is coming back to be a part of your life again. When we met, the atmosphere was taut as a string. Alex spoke calmly, judiciously. He tried to explain that he understood my hatred, that he didn't want to destroy what I had built. But you know what struck me the most? He said he was willing to walk out of Harry's life if that's what I wanted, that he wouldn't insist if it would bring pain to our son. Those words, oddly enough, made me think. Alex wasn't the man I remembered him to be. He had changed. Softer, wiser. And at that moment I thought for the first time, maybe it's not him. Maybe it's me. So easy to hold on to grudges. It's so easy to hate without trying to figure out what really happened. Maybe I just didn't give him a chance. I'm not saying everything's suddenly okay. No, of course not. But it was the first time I thought, what if I tried? What if I gave myself a chance to stop hating? A lot of things changed from that day on. We started going out all together infrequently, but enough so that Harry didn't feel like he was between two fires. Alex wasn't trying to take over my life anymore. He just wanted to be there for his son, and I let him. Not for me, for Harry. Time heals, as they say. And while I'm not sure that all wounds can heal, I do know one thing for sure. Sometimes we need to put the past behind us to give ourselves a chance to move on. Sometimes the best way to avoid losing a loved one is to accept that life can present unexpected twists and turns. And maybe that twist will lead you to something new. But you know what the most surprising thing is? I'm still not sure I made the right decision. After all, some things are hard to let go of. But I do know that despite all of that, I made the choice for the one I love most in the world, my son. Time passed and we slowly adjusted to this new reality. I couldn't say it was easy. Every time Harry walked towards Alex, I felt a slight jealousy and a dull ache somewhere deep inside. I was used to being everything to Harry, and now there was someone else next to him, taking up the space that I thought belonged only to me. But I tried to accept it. As time went on, I noticed that Harry became happier. He started sharing his thoughts with me, and even though our conversations weren't the same as they used to be, I realized that he didn't want to lose me. At some point I was relieved. Alex wasn't intruding into our lives too much, and that gave me time to get used to his presence. But what I couldn't get out of my head was the thought that maybe I've been wrong all these years. You know, when you live with one truth for years, it becomes a part of you. You get used to the idea that your view of a situation is the only right one. But then suddenly you find out there's another truth. One that you've been ignoring for a long time. And that realization made me think, what if I was wrong? One night, when Harry left again to meet Alex, I was alone. Usually at times like this, I tried to distract myself by cleaning, cooking, reading books. But that night was different. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and felt the memories of the past come flooding back to me. Alex. Our first meetings. His smile, his laugh, his strong but so unbearably complicated hands. It all came back to me. And with it came the realization that I hadn't thought about those moments in a long time. Sometimes it's easier to forget than to remember, especially if those memories are painful. But that night I let myself remember. And you know what I realized? Alex wasn't the monster I'd made him out to be in my head. Yes, we had our struggles. Yes, he left me at a difficult moment. But wasn't I ever wrong? Hadn't I made mistakes myself? With these thoughts, I decided to do something I had been putting off for a long time. I opened an old box of letters. The one I'd hidden when Harry was a boy. All his letters were in there. Alex had written to me after we broke up. He tried to explain himself, tried to connect. But I was too proud, too angry to give him the slightest chance. I reread those letters one by one. With each line my anger faded and was replaced by something else. Regret. There was another man in those letters. Someone I had once loved. And I realized that I was too focused on my pain to see his pain. In that moment I made a decision. Not for him. And not even for Harry. For me. The next day I called Alex. We agreed to meet again. But this time I wanted to talk to him not as someone I hated, but as someone who was a part of my past. A part that I had tried to bury for so long, but that was still alive in my memory. We met at the same cafe where we had met before. But it was different now. Alex looked calm, but there was a look of anticipation in his eyes. He probably didn't know what would happen next either. I want to talk about the past, I began. To say it was easy would be a lie. But I knew it was necessary. Alex looked at me carefully and nodded. We talked for a long time. About our mistakes, about how things might have been different if we hadn't split up. About how we were each too proud to admit our mistakes. I was finally able to tell him something that had been lingering inside of me for a long time. I was wrong too. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized that even though our paths had long since parted, we were still connected. And it wasn't just because of Harry. It was a part of life that couldn't just be erased. It was hard to admit it, but it was the beginning of my inner liberation. We didn't become friends with Alex. That would have been weird. But we found a way to coexist for Harry's sake. I no longer felt the intense hatred that used to consume me. Something else came instead. I couldn't call it forgiveness, but it was something similar. Humility, I guess. Life was starting to get better. Harry was happy, and that was the most important thing to me. Alex and I stopped avoiding each other, and though our meetings were rare, they no longer brought the pain they used to. One day Harry came to me and said, "Mommy, I'm so glad you and Daddy were able to find common ground. It means a lot to me." Those words were like a balm to my soul. I knew I'd made the right choice. But what's next? Will I ever be able to fully forgive Alex? Or would our relationship remain strained, even if for my son's sake I'd learned to live with it? Now that I look back on all the events that have happened over the past few months, I realize that this journey was necessary. Necessary for me to finally free myself from my inner shackles and give myself a chance at a new life. And I'll say one last thing. Don't be afraid to let go of the past. Even if it feels like it's holding you by the throat too tightly, sometimes letting go is the only way to breathe. And that's the most important lesson I learned from this story. It's been a few months since the day I realized it was time to live for myself. Those months have been a real revelation for me. I have slowly learned not only to take care of others, but also to take care of myself. This doesn't mean that I stopped thinking about Harry or that anything changed in our relationship. On the contrary, our relationship grew stronger. He saw that I was happy, that I was starting to find myself again, and that in turn made him feel freer. We no longer depended on each other the way we used to. There was a freedom in that. As for Alex, his role in our lives remained the same. He continued to date Harry, but never interfered in my life more than necessary. Occasionally we would run into each other at some family celebrations or important Harry events, but those encounters didn't evoke the same emotions in me that they used to. We learned to coexist. But the most important thing was that I finally learned to live in the present. You know how the past keeps pulling you back? When you think about what could have been, what you missed out on. That's the feeling that constantly haunted me until I decided to let go of all the old resentments. It certainly wasn't an instant decision. It took time to really let go. But once I did, life became easier. One day I realized that Alex no longer triggered negative emotions in me. I no longer thought about how he had hurt me, nor was I angry at him for the past. It didn't mean I forgave him completely, but I stopped carrying that weight inside. It was a release. I started taking more time for myself. I met up with a few old girlfriends I hadn't talked to in a while. We started having little get-togethers, weekend trips, and it became a kind of therapy for me. I finally realized that friendship and support was something I had been missing all these years. I had isolated myself too much, too focused on my son and his life, forgetting that I had my own. One of my friends, Iva, suggested I try something new. She had been doing photography for a long time, and suggested I participate in her project. It was something completely new for me and I was hesitant at first, but then I decided, why not? So I ended up in a studio where Iva was shooting portraits of women who wanted to rethink their attitude to themselves. It was a kind of psychological project, to help women see themselves in a new light through art and photography. I walked into the studio a little nervous, not knowing what to expect. But when Ira started taking pictures, I felt free. It was a strange but very pleasant feeling to stand in front of the camera and see yourself as you have never seen yourself before. Through Iva's lens, I saw a woman who was strong but vulnerable, who had been through a lot but had not lost herself. When Iva showed me the photos, I couldn't hold back the tears. They weren't just pictures. They were a reflection of who I had become. A woman who had gone through a difficult life, but found the strength to go on. These pictures became for me a symbol of my inner liberation. Iva offered me to write a short text for her project, and I agreed. I told my story, not the whole story of course, but the most important moments. How I lost myself after my divorce, how I tried to live only for my son, how I was afraid of the past, and how I finally found a way to move forward. This project became a kind of therapy for me. Through photos and text, I was able to live all my emotions once again, realize them and finally let go. I stopped being afraid to look back. I no longer blamed myself for the decisions I made years ago. I realized that I had done the best I could then under the circumstances that I had. And that's what mattered most. A few more weeks went by. One day Harry came into my kitchen and, as if by the way, he said, "Mom, Alex said you've changed a lot lately. He said you've become different. Quieter or something." I smiled. It was probably the best praise I'd ever heard. Not from Alex, of course, but from Harry. He could see that I'd finally found myself. And I was proud that I'd been able to show him an example of how important it was to be able to move on, despite all of life's trials. Now that I look back on this whole journey, I realize that Alex was as much a part of my life as Harry was. But that doesn't mean I should have let the past rule my present. We all make mistakes. We all go through difficult moments. But the most important thing is to be able to find the strength to move on without looking back with regret. I don't know how my life will turn out next. Maybe there will be more trials, maybe there will be new discoveries. But I know one thing for sure now. I am stronger than I thought. And that knowledge gives me the strength to go forward. If you were to ask me what I learned from this story, I would say this: life is a constant movement. Sometimes you need to stop, realize your mistakes, forgive yourself and others, and move on. That is true freedom. And time will tell what will happen next.